Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Elly Desmarchelier.
And I'm John Barron. And Elly, I know a lot of our viewers will have seen you on The Drum before, or on Q&A the other night, or read some of the great op-eds you've been doing for The Guardian and elsewhere. But for those who don't know, what brings you here tonight as our special co-host, and why is today or tomorrow such a significant day?
Well, tomorrow is International Day of People with Disability, and I've been here at The Drum all week producing a story which you'll see a little bit later on. I'm a disability rights campaigner, have been for, well, my whole life, but I was most recently the national spokesperson for the Defend Our NDIS campaign and campaigns before that. I got my start at age 17 in the ALP, gave me a job in state politics in Queensland. I like to say I use everything they taught me against them now. So, yeah, I'm a proud disability rights campaigner. I'm proud to be here today for International Day of People with Disability.
And you're a huge fan of American politics, so you and I have been talking all week.
We have. We've been nerding out together.
It's been great. All right, you want to introduce the panel for us?
Absolutely. So joining us today on the panel, former New South Wales Nationals MP and Food Sustainability Specialist, Niall Blair. In the central west of New South Wales, writer and disability advocate Elly Gibbs. And in Canberra, CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Andrew McKellar.
And you can join us as well on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're also on Facebook tonight. Well, first to Canberra, and it is done. Federal Parliament has wrapped up for 2022. It was a mammoth final week. Laws were passed to establish a federal anti-corruption commission, and 7 recommendations from the landmark Respect at Work report went through Parliament as well. It all ended with a bit of a sprint to the finish line, with politicians debating well into the night in order to pass Labor's centrepiece Industrial Relations Bill.
Today is a win for the heroes of the pandemic. Yeah. The cleaners, the disability workers, the aged care workers, the early childhood educators, heroes of the pandemic and heroes each and every day. They got our thanks, but they deserve more than that. They deserve better conditions and they deserve better pay. Yeah. This legislation will get that moving again.
Well, it's certainly been a big year in Canberra. After almost a decade of coalition rule, the federal election in May saw Labor form government with a lengthy to-do list. It included wrestling with a debt-ridden budget, reviewing the NDIS and accelerating action on climate change. Here's a look back at how it all unfolded.
Mr. Speaker, like you, Prime Minister will resume his seat. This election has never been about me or my feelings or anything like that.
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4. Sorry, I'm not sure what it is.
What's the current WPI?
Google it, mate.
The election has delivered the biggest challenge to the two-party system that has been entrenched since 1910.
We need to change the way that politics operates in this country.
And I bear true allegiance to the colonising Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Senator Thorpe.
It seems like a pretty sad day in Australia when in 2022 we're hearing arguments about climate science. After however long of the bullshit that Australians have had to...
Senator Pocock, that language is not parliamentary.
Prime Minister, doesn't charity begin at home? And when will you start helping Australian families?
This is a responsible budget that is right for the times and readies us for the future.
So we need to ensure we have reliability in the system. That's why a new capacity mechanism, I don't want to get too nerdy for the viewers.
Put your masks on. From repeated infection.
When I first came into this job, that I support the ICAC, and certainly I do.
280 pages of detail about how the voice will operate.
It is strange to describe such actions as a power grab, as they were never exercised.
He owes an apology to the Australian people.
Peter needs help, so I have him a lightsaber, which you can use in question time against the Prime Minister.
Well, for a closer look at the year that was in Canberra, we're joined by Anthony Galloway. He's a political correspondent with the Sun Herald and the Sunday Age. Anthony, welcome to you.
Great to be with you.
What was the mood there in Canberra like? Last day of Parliament was like muck-up day at school, or flower bombs and people writing "I love you" on each other's shirts?
Yeah, well, I think we're all pleasantly surprised because this time yesterday we thought we would have to sit on Saturday, which would have just been a nightmare for everyone after such a long and hectic year. So to our surprise, Parliament ended up rising this morning. It only sat for really a few minutes. So after such a kind of long and stressful year, it's good that we're just, everyone's leaving, especially for those of us who live in Canberra.
It's amazing how overtime on Saturday tends to focus the mind.
Yeah, I think the Albanese government has to be careful not to pull this trigger too much. They've already done it a bit with threats to sit on weekends and extending Parliament, and it seems to get results, but I don't know if you can do that in perpetuity.
So this does mark 6 months of the Albanese government, sort of 3 sitting periods of Parliament. A lot of big ticket items went through. How do you think they will be feeling at this point?
Oh, I think they're quite content that they got the big things passed that were kind of election promises or kind of big promises once they got in. So it's the Industrial Relations Bill and the National Anti-Corruption legislation as well. They needed really, you know, in a political sense, to pass those before Christmas. So they're very happy about that. But they know that there's, you know, they've kicked some cans down the road and the political year isn't over. There's a big kind of fight on power prices and energy brewing, and that'll all come to a head at National Cabinet on Wednesday. So there's a few things to go, and then looking forward into next year, there's kind of a lot of kind of, as I said, cans have kicked down the road, a lot of reviews that need to come back. It's not necessarily a criticism. Some of these things needed to be looked at in depth, but we're talking about the Angus Houston, Stephen Smith review into defence. We're talking about the defence review into what to do about the AUKUS submarines. We're talking about what to do about the NDIS to put that on a more sustainable footing. The gig economy legislation, and of course the voice, which may really dominate the political landscape, the Indigenous voice to Parliament. So I think next year is going to be a massive political year for the government.
And I'm interested to know, apart from those reviews, obviously, as you said, they got some of those big commitments locked in this week. What commitments do you think they're going to want to really make sure they get to first when Parliament sits next year?
Well, the big one will be energy, and after, I mean, the thing that perhaps scares me is we might be seeing Parliament sitting again before Christmas if the result out of National Cabinet is something significant that requires legislative change. They may not be able to wait. They might have to sit in late December or January to actually pass that. States might have to recall parliaments to pass what they need to do at a state level. So they can't be seen to kind of come to some kind of big agreement and there be no urgency about lowering power bills. For me, the big one is the voice. Albanese made the decision to do it next year. We could have that as soon as June, July. The referendum could be as soon as June or July next year. He may very well to come into the new year and decide to do it sooner rather than later, so that the No campaign doesn't get its legs up and doesn't have time to kind of really sow doubt into the community. So it's a big kind of moral test for Albanese, and it's a big kind of moment for Indigenous Australians.
Niall, as a former senior member of the National Party, I wonder, what's your assessment as to how the two sides have sort of squared up in this post-election early governmental period, and also what the Albanese government was able to do, not just on the domestic front, but also looking at Australia's place in the region and the world?
Yeah, look, I think that's where the real success of this year starts. I think this has been a bit of a reset for Australia on the international stage. As someone that is involved in private land conservation through the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, to see the fact that we've signed up to international agreements, 30 by 30 in private land conservation, to see the resetting when it comes to climate commitments, but also that engagement with some of our really key trading partners. You know, to see the Prime Minister with President of China just recently meeting, hopefully we'll start to see a bit of a reset and a defrost in some of those tensions that we've seen, but also with our closest neighbours as well. So I think a really great start to reset Australia with our closest neighbours, some of our best trading partners, but also globally, to tell the world that we are here to not just trade, but also to pull our weight and play our part. And I think the government's done a great job on that. But also, you know, addressing some of the risks. You know, we could talk about a lot of the other areas around the economy, but last time I was on the panel, we were talking about biosecurity risks. And I think that government has done a really good job through Minister Watt working with industry to address some of those biosecurity risks for our agricultural sector here in Australia. So I think it's been a great start.
Elle, closer to home, I feel like the conversation that me and my friends and family are having is constantly around housing and housing affordability, accessibility, whether you're renting or owning, and that feels like something that we haven't seen a whole lot of action. Is there an issue for you where you feel like the government made some commitments during the election but hasn't quite met the expectations that you were hoping?
I think the standout one for me is action on raising income support payments, particularly job seeker, which is so far below the poverty line that, you know, to be honest, it is a disgrace that a rich country like us are still expecting people to live on such a small amount of money. Half the people who are living on job seeker are disabled and sick people. And I think that it has been an opportunity, it would be really nice to see an opportunity to make an announcement before Christmas so that people have some hope and aren't going into the Christmas period going, how on earth do I eat? I mean, we're seeing reports of people, you know, I saw one of a woman who's actually got, you know, a light bulb that she takes between rooms because she can't afford to buy another one and to have them all on as well. And she's living on toast and can't afford food. And, you know, we're a better country than this. So I'd really like to see some significant action around our income support payments and a broader income support system. You know, like others, I'm really keen to see, you know, action around the voice and the referendum in the new year. It's what First Nations people are asking us to do. And I live in a very safe national seat out here in the country. So I was really disappointed to see their stand this week. And I wrote, you know, a little earnest letter to my MP, Andrew G, and he did come out really strongly and say he was going to support the voice and the Uluru statement, which was great. So I think that my sense is the Nats have misstepped this a little bit in terms of how they think regional people are feeling. The other big one that I'm going to watch for next year is, of course, the Disability Royal Commission will report. So we don't know what they're going to say, and because they've given no interim recommendations, which is very unusual for a Royal Commission, and we don't know how the government is going to respond. So there are some really big things coming up. We talk a lot about the NDIS, but you know, the Royal Commission is actually going to be a much bigger deal next year in terms of how the lives of disabled people are in Australia and how we can start to fix the different systems that aren't working for us.
Elly, I've got a question for you on the NDIS and the way that possibly the Royal Commission will inform this review that we're seeing now. A lot of attention was placed on the cost of the NDIS when that figure of $50 billion came out in the October budget. And some people were saying, well, we have to find ways of reining in costs. But it seems that Minister Shorten is trying to find ways to make it sustainable without reducing eligibility or cutting services. How hard a task is that going to be, do you think?
Well, I think with the premise of that question, I don't accept that the cost of the NDIS is blowing out and does need significant reining in. So the cost of the NDIS next year is expected to rise 12%. The cost of health and aged care is rising 11%. But we're not having a conversation here about whether, you know, we should be supporting our older Australians or whether we should be investing money in public health. I think the review needs to be far, far more reaching and broader than a cost-cutting review. What it needs to do is ensure that the NDIS is actually meeting its core principles of offering people with disability choice and control over the supports they need to live their best life. And some of that is going to mean saving some money. So for example, an example I always use is at the moment, I can go see a physio for an hour and my partner can go directly after me and see the same physio for an hour, and she'll pay $80 and I'll pay $280. Wow. And that's because I have an NDIS plan, and the NDIS price guide says you can charge up to $280. Now, I make the argument to my physio all the time, the core word there is guide, but they're charging the top dollar you can charge. I think there's money, like some smart changes and reforms there that can save money that isn't about taking away services, and we can't talk about reducing eligibility because that again is pitting one disabled person up against another disabled person, and that's not what the NDIS was all about. We've got to remember that yes, there is a cost to this, but for every dollar invested in the NDIS, you get a $2.25 return. So there is a huge economic benefit to the NDIS as well.
Andrew McKellar, as we get towards the end of the year, the Albanese government set out with a sort of a Hawke-style consensus approach, giving business and unions a seat at the table at the Jobs Summit. Then we saw the IR bill that business wasn't necessarily particularly enamoured with. How do you think the business community more broadly is feeling after 6 months of the new government?
Well, John, I think what you've described there is right. I mean, certainly as we went into the Jobs and Skills Summit, honestly, I think there was a lot of really goodwill right across the board for the new government. Business community very much part and parcel of that. Obviously, you know, coming out of that, I mean, the narrative, as you say, was around building a consensus-style approach to policy and to a reform agenda. I don't think that's been fully carried through with these industrial relations reforms. I don't think the government's been quite as successful in pulling all of the stakeholders around the table, explaining what it's doing, taking the time to make that case and to, convince people to their agenda. They've really rushed this and pushed it through. So I think that's unfortunate. Now, that said, it's also very important to say that, you know, one issue doesn't define the relationship. I think there's still a lot of goodwill with business. Business has been strongly supportive of a lot of things the government has done in its first 6 months. You know, in particular, you know, we've seen across the board business groups supporting the government's lifting its ambition in terms of our climate change objectives, getting Australia back into the game there internationally. The work that's been done on skills, migration, these things were addressed in the Jobs and Skills Summit. They were addressed in the budget statement in October. So, you know, I think, you know, the government can be proud of the achievements that it's made in this first 6 months. Obviously, we've hit a bit of a speed bump with these industrial relations changes. I really hope we can go forward with a much more consensus-driven approach, because there are some big issues out there on the horizon next year. We talked about gig economy, it was mentioned a moment ago. There are other issues in the labour market and in the reform agenda or the legislative agenda the government will be bringing forward next year. So let's hope we can get back to that sort of consensus ambition.
Anthony, final question for you before we let you go. I wonder, what is your broader review of what we have seen from the way the government is functioning with the support of the Greens and David Pocock in the Senate? It seems to be a pretty smooth process. The opposition also seems to be, so far at least, surprisingly united and not as dispirited as some first-term oppositions tend to be. All in all, it seems like it's sort of, I don't know, things have kind of settled down a bit. What's going on there?
Yeah, for the moment, you're right. It seems to be quite a relatively easy path for the government to pass legislation. We saw that with the passage of the IR bill. In the Senate, they only need the Greens and then +1, and it seems to be a pretty workable path with either David Pocock or one of the two Lambie senators providing that final vote. Pauline Hanson and One Nation have completely dealt themselves out out of relevance. So that's kind of interesting there. Yeah, but the government probably deserves credit for kind of finding that workable path. It seems quite easy for them to get through what they have needed to get through so far. On the opposition, I don't think you can understate how kind of divided they were after the election this year. Scott Morrison, after he took the leadership, kind of held together these kind of two warring wings of the party in relation to the Conservatives and moderates, but it kind of was unravelling towards the end. And Peter Dutton is really, as his first priority, just focused on uniting the opposition, uniting that party room. And for a new opposition, it does seem relatively stable, united. It's nothing like the coalition was in 2007, for example, where you had leadership tensions between Brendan Nelson and Malcolm Turnbull. I think Dutton has made the assessment so far to just hold fire quite a bit, that the government's at the peak of its honeymoon. That's been aided by the Morrison multiple ministry scandal, and that, you know, don't waste your oxygen when you got no cut through anyway. So I think it's an open question of what Dutton does next once, you know, going into next year, once the government starts making some stumbles, as governments inevitably do, does he get cut through then?
Anthony Galloway, good to talk to you. Thank you. Anthony is a political correspondent for The Sun and the Herald Sun and The Age. Well, in a bizarre interview with internet shock jock and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, the US rapper and producer formerly known as Kanye West has gone on an anti-Semitic tirade overnight, literally praising Hitler.
You're not a Nazi. You don't deserve to be called that and demonized.
Well, I see good things about Hitler also.
The rapper, now known as simply Ye, has been called out in the past for offensive conspiracy theories in various interviews and on social media. He was recently banned from Instagram and Twitter for anti-Jewish comments. His Twitter account, though, has since been reinstated, and multiple brands like Adidas and The Gap have severed their ties with him.
Now, this interview with Alex Jones comes off the back of a dinner hosted by Donald Trump 2 weeks ago, which both Kanye West and white supremacist Nick Fonte attended. Trump has claimed he was not aware of Fonte's views at the time of the meeting, but Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell has hit out at the former president.
There is no room in the Republican Party for anti-Semitism or white supremacy. And anyone meeting with people advocating that point of view, in my judgment, are highly unlikely to ever be elected President of the United States.
Now, Elle, I've been pretty disappointed to see that a lot of Kanye's supporters online have used the fact that he has been open about his bipolar diagnosis as a kind of excuse. You know, he has mental health issues. That's why he's making these comments. You and I both know and work with people who have bipolar, who manage to get around every day and not praise Hitler and Nazis. So what would you say to people who think that we should go a bit easier on Kanye because of his health conditions?
Yeah, I'm not a fan, as you can probably tell, but also this is not unique to West. I think this happens quite often when, you know, these far-right extremists use violence. Not that I'm saying that West did that, but you know, use violence. People often say, oh, it was a mental health issue or it was a psychosocial disability. And I'm going to use a technical term and say that that's bullshit. You know, people with disability are the targets of far-right and extremist groups. And this kind of language, you know, takes us down a really dark path. So I think that equating disabled people with the perpetrators of this kind of violent language and actions is absolutely not on. So disabled people have been fighting against these kind of beliefs and these kind of attitudes for a really long time. And we're a big part of the organising in the US that saw the Republicans not achieve the results that they were promising, that so-called red wave. And excuse my cynicism, but watching Mitch McConnell turn around and go, oh, such a concern about white supremacy. Now that it's actually not a successful electoral strategy, I'm feeling a little bit cynical about all of that.
Niall, Kanye West, I guess it could be easy to dismiss him. I mean, he's a singer. Why do we even care what he thinks about anything? He's a singer. We like his music. We don't like his music. But the fact is, he has a platform. He has millions of followers. He gets to sit down with the former president of the United States last week. 3 weeks ago, he wasn't talking to Alex Jones on InfoWars. He was talking to Tucker Carlson on the top-rated cable news program in America. And the interview there, apparently Tucker Carlson cut out the very pro-Hitler stuff, but left in the sort of Democrats are racists, kind of borderline anti-Semitic stuff as well. So he's being used, or is he using these platforms, and should somebody be stepping in and going, like, you just shouldn't be doing this, but this person shouldn't have a mouthpiece?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. And I think that's the danger here, is the fact that we're even talking about it on a Friday night here in Australia. Really shows the level of impact and reach that these platforms can give someone with extreme views. And I think it's a bit of both, because those that may not support Kanye, that want to try and still repeat his message, can jump on and then, take that and then spread it through, other social media. So I think it's dangerous. Absolutely, people should be jumping in. I don't know, though, that he's probably surrounding himself with people that'll tell him to stop it. So then we need to think about what platforms and who's controlling those platforms to be able to step in and say, there are certain standards that society should be able to say, we don't want that message spread for a whole range of reasons. And someone needs to be able to I guess, fill that void and take some action.
Elly, you and I both follow American politics. It is tempting to sort of think, well, surely associating with somebody who is literally praising Hitler a week after you break bread with them at Mar-a-Lago, surely this has got to be the end of the road for Donald Trump. Do you feel that, or do you feel that the Teflon Don still has a pretty thick coat of Teflon?
Of course he does. Mitch McConnell can come out and say that that's not acceptable, but let's be real. Mitch McConnell does not represent the base of the Republican Party. And I would love to agree with Niall on we shouldn't be talking about it here in Australia or on a Friday night. But the reality is these are the conversations that a lot of people are having. Even in Australia, we have a problem with white supremacy. And if we don't talk about it and we don't call it out for what it is, then we risk it kind of continuing, quietly happening underground with no consequences. And, we really need to call out Kanye for what he did and the connection he has with Donald Trump. But do I think it's going to affect Trump's popularity with the Republican Party? Absolutely not. This is a man that started his presidential campaign by saying all Mexicans were rapists. What happened in saying there are good and bad people on both sides. Sure. He is a smart operator in terms of he knows his base, and he knows that his base probably liked him meeting with Kanye. So sadly, no. And I don't think we can ignore it. I think we have to call it out for what it is. I think we have to be really conscious that it could happen here in Australia. Be on top of it.
Andrew McKellar, when Donald Trump made a number of those other comments that Elly referred to there, he was President of the United States, and there was a lot of reasons for the Republican Party to stay publicly behind him. Now he is a former president trying to make a comeback with falling approval ratings and increasing numbers of Republicans trying to distance themselves from him. Some are daring to dream that finally the Trump bubble has burst, and it may be Kanye that has helped to burst it.
Well, look, clearly it's a very polarised situation in the United States. That said, obviously there was a result where the Republicans and the Trump-backed candidates fell well short in the recent midterm elections. But look, I agree with what Elly said here, and that is I don't think we can tolerate for a moment the sort of language that Kanye West was using there, and I think it would be an absolute mistake for any politician to try to associate themselves with that or take advantage from that. It has to be called out for what it is, and anybody who's trying to align themselves with that, I think, really should get the full consequences, and really they don't deserve any support at all.
And interesting to note that Kanye West's Twitter account that had been suspended has been reinstated again. So Elon Musk is still keeping up this absolutist free speech approach. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the program, Elly has been working with the Drum this week and doing some interviewing and reporting for us. And Elly, what's been your focus?
Well, John, when the Drum gave me free rein to produce my own story for International Day of People with Disability, there was one statistic that I knew I had to cover because it's been bugging me all year. I turned 30 this year, and in those 30 years, the unemployment rate for people with disability has barely changed. So I wanted to use my time at the program to talk to people with disability about their experiences finding work. So here's how I spent my week at the Drum. Speaking directly to people with disability is always the best way to find out more about the issues that impact our lives. So I've hit the road to meet with Sophie, a young woman with cerebral palsy who has landed a job after a difficult hunt.
Sophie, hi. Hi, how are you?
She tells me that her new job has given her the opportunity to live independently and has renewed her sense of purpose. Can you tell us about your new job?
Yes, really excited. I've always been passionate about the disability sector, and so I've recently landed myself a new job working for First People's Disability Network as a policy officer.
But it took Sophie, who has an inclusive education degree and a community services diploma, 5 months to find a job in the disability sector.
I found that people were putting me in the too hard basket because I required additional adjustments.
Sophie, do you think discrimination was a factor in you struggling to find a job?
Discrimination was definitely a factor, and I think that has definitely played on my confidence over the years. It definitely has gotten me down at times.
The reality is Sophie's not alone. The Human Rights Commission tells us that 1 in 5 Australians with disability have experienced discrimination at work, and it's even higher if you have an intellectual disability.
It would be hard for me to get interviews. I would get a lot of rejection emails, and it was really hard for me to get a job.
Ben is 37 and has lived experience of intellectual disability. While he's now in a job he loves, he spent years unemployed, looking for work. He's now built a career raising awareness of the rights of people with intellectual disability in the workplace.
A lot of businesses out there are afraid to employ someone with an intellectual disability because of the unknowns.
And what would you say to a business that's afraid of the unknown? What would you say to them?
I would say to them, give us a chance.
People like Ben and me who live with disability are twice as likely to be unemployed compared to those without disability. The person who is now responsible for disability employment and delivering change is Minister for Social Services, Amanda Rishworth. Lots of ministers have tried to change this statistic before you and failed. So what are you going to do differently to actually reduce disability unemployment?
I am very much looking at different ways that we can address this. I think business is part of the solution here. Businesses need to understand that employing people with a disability is an opportunity and not a challenge. When you've got 88% of people living with disability not requiring any workplace modifications, and then those that do are relatively minor.
But if the last 30 years has taught us anything, it's that changing this statistic requires a whole of community effort. Like Sophie and Ben, I've experienced disability discrimination in the workplace. And until we make our workplaces safer for people with disability, we simply won't see more people with disability getting jobs. And I, for one, refuse to let another 30 years go by without progress. Now, the ABC's Disability Affairs reporter Elizabeth Wright is also joining us to take a closer look at this issue. Liz, welcome to the program.
Hi, Elly.
Hi. So I'm really interested to know, have you experienced disability discrimination at work? And what did that experience teach you?
I certainly have. I think, like probably a majority of disabled people, I have experienced those barriers into employment. I will never forget the first job that I ever applied for, and I got through to interview stage. I didn't disclose my disability in my application because at that point, there wasn't an option to disclose any disability at all. I remember turning up to the interview, opening the door, walking in, and the man literally stood up and immediately said, didn't even say hello to me, just said, "Oh, you won't be able to do this job. There's no point doing this interview." And as a 20-year-old, I was absolutely devastated to not even have been given a chance to sit down and talk about my skills, my potential, and what I hope to achieve in the role. And this was a pattern that has certainly been repeated in various ways over many years, to the point that when I moved to the UK to live, I actually went self-employed. Again, that's another common thing with the disability community, that a lot of the time we end up going self-employed because no one else will employ us except ourselves.
Yeah. And Elle, we heard in that package, absolutely everybody had experienced disability discrimination. I don't know a disabled person that hasn't experienced disability discrimination in the workplace. So that leads me to think, are our anti-discrimination laws fit for practice really and purpose at the moment? And if not, what could we do to try and stop disability discrimination in the workplace?
Look, they're great questions, and I think you've nailed it there, Elly, because discrimination is the key reason that we are shut out of work. And we continue not talking about it. We talk about employer confidence and all of these euphemisms rather than actually talking about discrimination and tackling discrimination. So in terms of dealing with it, one way would be to fix the Disability Discrimination Act, which right now is pretty broken. There's been some complicated legal cases that have gone through that mean that it's just not fit for purpose anymore, and it doesn't work in terms of protecting us from discrimination, or in terms of dealing with complaints, or in terms of getting systemic kind of change. But one of the other things, we often talk about this, and I've had the same experiences of discrimination at work, being refused my adjustments, not in the past either, like even in the last few years. So the kinds of things that we need to fix are, yes, discrimination, but we've also got to stop some of the structural barriers to getting a job, because we talk about it often as though we're the problem. So us as disabled people with our wonky bodies and all brains and all of that stuff, that we're the problem, when actually it is the structural issues. And I'll give you some really clear examples. So if you're a person with intellectual disability who have, most people with intellectual disability aren't in jobs at the moment, and they have the biggest barriers to entry. So if you're a person with intellectual disability and you go to Centrelink and you go, yep, I'm going to go and try and get a job. If you are assessed by Centrelink through some archaic assessment system that you can't work more than 8 hours a week, you cannot even get in the door of the disability employment services. So you can't even get in the door of the services meant to get you a job. So if you rely on the disability support pension, which many of us do, and I did for a decade, if you try work, you can not only lose your income support payment, but lose your essential access to affordable medical care and also some disability services. So we've got to fix that too. And then if you get supports in your NDIS plan to go to work and to do your job, the NDIS can turn around and go, oh, we don't need to do those supports anymore because you've got a job now and you might lose your job. So we've got to fix that too. So there's those kind of parts of the disability system, not even the mainstream system, that we've got to fix, because these are the barriers that are stopping people getting into work and actually having the supports they need to do their job when they get there. But I also want the organisations that are making their living out of disabled people, so disability employment services, disability service providers, to actually start employing disabled people, particularly people with intellectual disability. So Life Without Barriers, which is the biggest disability service provider in Australia, has recently announced a target of 15%, and hopefully a target for people with intellectual disability as well, which will be a really good start. So I mean, I'm now, after 30 years, as you've said, Elly, and I'm a bit older than you, but I'm now coming down on the side of targets, quotas, getting very serious about making people employ us when they make their money out of us.
Yeah. And Andrew, to be fairly blunt with you, we've been told for well over a decade, businesses just need some education. They need some support to understand how to be more inclusive. We're going to give them some more incentives to employ people with disability. We're going to help them with more information. And that hasn't resulted in any more people with disability being employed. It hasn't changed that employment rate. So my question to you is, how many more years does business need of education campaigns and incentives before they'll actually get on with the job of just employing people with disability?
Well, Elly, thank you for your very powerful report. One of the things that surprised me as I was researching this issue, preparing for our discussion today, I was surprised to find that for people with a disability, the labour force participation rate, it's only around 53%, and it hasn't changed really over 3 decades, as you say. So I was surprised to see that. Honestly, I thought it would have been increasing, particularly in the years since we've had the NDIS coming into play, lifting opportunity, providing people with a greater chance to achieve that potential. Clearly, that's not having enough of an impact. I do think here one of the issues that we've been looking at is the extent to which disability employment services can be integrated more with mainstream employment services. We have to get a situation where people who have a disability are just coming into those recruitment processes in a standard way. You should be seeing that much more often, and to be honest, as an employer, I'm not seeing it enough. We have to change that. We also have to ensure that employers do understand that the actual cost of employing somebody with a disability is perhaps not what they think. It's actually very affordable to do. It should be a straightforward decision to give those people a chance. They have the skills, they can do the jobs in many cases. Of course, we have to make sure that our workplaces are fit for purpose and that we can do that. But at the moment, clearly, something is failing. We're not achieving
Andrew,
the sorts of results we should.
You say there that we need to make it clear that it's not costly to employ people with disability, but simply not employing someone because they have a disability is illegal. Whether it costs them more or not, if they are the right person for the job and best fit for it, because they have a disability is irrelevant. And every single disabled person we've spoken to, Liz, Elle, Ben and Sophie, have said that businesses are discriminating against them. How, as a representative body of businesses, what are you doing to ensure that businesses aren't discriminating against people with disability?
Well, look, as I say, I think one of the critical things here is making sure we can put those candidates in front of employers as a standard part of the selection process. If employers have to go through a special agency, special process that's separate from their mainstream process of recruitment, then I think that's going to be a disadvantage to start with. Look, there were some extremely powerful testimonies on this in the Jobs and Skills Summit in September. One of the most effective advocates on this was someone like Dylan Alcott, and also one of his colleagues, Stephanie Agnew, who was able to describe very much what you had in your report, the sorts of, I think, discrimination that she had encountered in the employment process over much of her career. And I do see the sorts of startups that people like Dylan are now working with, Skilled Access. This hopefully can make a difference. But I think if we're putting people who have a disability into that mainstream selection process, integrating that, honestly, I hope we will get better results. We have to get better results.
Niall, I'm going to ask you, it's interesting that Andrew there references Dylan Alcott, because he's actually just set up a accessible employment app. An app where people with disability can put their own CVs, and you know, for people who are illiterate or can't read, they actually can record their CVs as videos and audio. Mainstream employment services are simply inaccessible for people with disability. So my question again, I guess, is how do we start to challenge this idea that it's not about not understanding the rules or not being inclusive or the need for more education, but that people are actually being discriminated against, and that's illegal, and how do we stop doing that? Do you have any suggestions?
Certainly not my area of expertise. Obviously, if people are being discriminated against, then that certainly needs to be followed up. And I think part of the challenge is we're all facing you know, a need for employees at the moment right across the country. We've got really low unemployment rates, and this is the time to be having these conversations. It's probably a little bit out of my area as to what are some of the strategies to come up with it, but I'm being more informed just being in part of this conversation, and I'm involved in businesses that are looking for people, and if there are apps and more of these conversations happening, I know that I'll be going back and talking to my organisations about how are we performing in this area. So I don't have a silver bullet. I'm learning myself just through this conversation. I think the fact that we're having this conversation is hopefully of a benefit to a whole range of employers out there to try and learn more. And it sounds like from the discussion there are other alternatives and ways to be able to get these candidates in front of employers. But yeah, I don't have a suggestion other than to say I'm just taking this all in and hopefully seeing what we can do on the other side.
Yeah, well, you know, 1 in 5 Australians have a disability. So if you are in a workplace with more than 5 people and there's not a disabled person around, you've got to ask why.
Very good question. Now, we're going to talk about the notion of disability pride. And Elly, I know this is something that you're particularly passionate about.
Yeah, so most people with disability go on a bit of a journey when it comes to disability pride, and that includes me. When I started my career, I made sure my professional headshots didn't show my wheelchair or any mobility aids. I was so worried I'd miss out on interviews if potential employers knew I was disabled. But after a couple of bad experiences in workplaces, I realised that if an employer didn't want to hire me because I was disabled, I didn't want to work there. So after that, I changed my headshots, and they became a way of me actually displaying my disability pride. Liz, you've spent this week looking into disability pride and what it means. What's been your journey with disability pride?
It's been, I think, again, a very similar journey to probably a lot of people in the disability community. I Went to 2 Paralympic Games when I was a teenager, and I had a very strong body. I was very proud of what I was achieving within that space, but you could say that outside of that space, outside of that safety almost of the Australian swim team, where I was with other athletes who were like me, experiencing disability like me, I felt a lot of shame and embarrassment about my limb difference. And I remember as a teenager, there I would be in the pool with a swimming costume training, and then as soon as I was out of there I would be with, you know, on a hot summer's day with heavy jeans on, you know, a cardigan, trying to hide my disability and pass as non-disabled as I possibly could, which, you know, when you have a very visible physical disability, that's really quite hard. And it took me moving to the UK and really discovering this disability pride movement to really change my attitude about how I felt about myself and my body. And, you know, I went from trying to hide my disability to then going, you know what, I want to be able to wear the clothes that I want without feeling embarrassment or shame. I want to be able to walk down the street and not feel like I have to modify my behaviour to make other people feel comfortable. I am going to wear what I want, and I'm going to be proud of who I am and what my limb difference has enabled me to be and to have these opportunities. So yes, during the week, I have been exploring disability pride in the lead up to International Day of People with Disability. And I actually sat down and had a chat with a number of disability advocates who are really pushing for disability pride. And one of those advocates is Hannah Solomons, who is a very proud autistic woman. And she told me what she thought about disability pride.
I'd like it to no longer need to have a protest element. That's the day. I look forward to the day when it doesn't need to have a protest element. That's what I look forward to. That we've created so much cultural change in the way people think about disabilities, the way disabled people think of themselves, that disability pride is just taken for granted, and people go out of their way to ensure that we are included. I think that will be a while. I'd like to see it build into more activities throughout the year, grow into a movement. I think, you know, realistically, we could see it become just like other cultural festivals in Sydney, like a big event that celebrates a minority group with pride.
So, Elle, if there's a disabled person out there watching who this whole concept of disability pride is actually a new thing that they're hearing about, and they're going, oh wow, this is a journey I could start and I might want to look into, what would you say to them? What would you say to them about learning to have pride in your disability?
Oh, it's so lovely hearing everyone talking about disability pride. Firstly, we don't get opportunities to, you know, talk about that in our community and in public very often. So I became disabled when I was 19, which is now a very long time ago. And I spent the first sort of 15 years of being disabled, being very sick and spending large amounts of time in hospital, at times for months, and being told all the time that the only thing that I needed to focus on was not being sick and not being disabled. That the most important thing I could do was just focus on a cure, which of course was impossible, but that's called the medical model of disability. And lots of us grow up in those kind of environments where we're told all the time that we just have to focus on fixing our bodies, fixing our minds, making us not disabled anymore. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I even found the disability community and started to understand that I was part of a community that had a long kind of history and a lineage and was full of the most fantastic activists and troublemakers, and that had got all of this change that I benefited from. Like, I got disability supports at home, I got the disability support pension, and they had built this system that was supporting me. So the disability community is where I'm accepted and wanted, and it's where my differences are what include me, not what excludes me. Like Liz, and she and I have talked about this a bit, I have at times a very stigmatised visible disability, and people can have what I have called in the past a strong reaction to how I look. And coming into a community where that not only is not an issue, but no one asks me about it, no one asks me for a cure or any of that kind of stuff is amazing. And I hope for that so much for so many disabled people. And if you are a younger disabled person or a newly disabled person, you're part of a really amazing community, and you can find it online in lots of social media places, but go looking for it, because we are here, and there are books and there are movies and podcasts and lots of things, and we're here to support you and to welcome you.
Elly, I can see how this notion of disability pride can be incredibly empowering. Does it also come at a cost if, as Liz suggests, you take that step to say, I'm not going to hide it, I'm going to wear the clothes I want to wear? That, in some instances, that draws more attention, it draws stares, it draws the kinds of things that can be really confronting when you're just going about your daily life.
Yeah, of course. You know, I am always proudly, you know, in my wheelchair, and I go about my days very normally. You know, I will never forget the day where I was driving through the Sunshine Coast up in Queensland, and I just thought, I'm just going to pop a picnic blanket down and sit with my partner and enjoy the beach, and a random woman decided that that was the moment she was going to come up to me, sit down on our picnic rug, put her hands on my shoulders and pray for me. And I have never felt so embarrassed or humiliated in all my life. My partner was quite upset, but that is a reflection of her. That is not a reflection of my disability. The idea that she thought I needed to be cured by her religion, the idea that she thought that I would benefit and appreciate her curing me, says a lot about her misunderstanding that I am so grateful to be part of the community that Elle is talking about. I'm so proud to be disabled.
And that she thought she was doing the right thing and that she was entitled to do it. Look, the worst thing you will find about hosting a program like The Drum is you have a wonderful panel and a wonderful conversation, and the director tells you you're out of time. That is all the time we have for this edition. But Elly Desmarchelier, thank you so much. We've had a wonderful week. Thank you for being here.
Can I just thank the ABC? This has been an incredible opportunity where a disabled person has been given 5 days to produce a segment and also co-host. It's an incredible representation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elly. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you to our panellists as well, Niall Blair, Elle Gibbs and Andrew McKellar, and our very special guest, Liz Wright, as well. We'll be back with you on Monday night. Have a great weekend. Till then, good night.
Good night.